most Democrats anyway have turned against Israel and more pro-Palestine now. But even young Republicans, even young evangelicals, especially people from America First, right? The mega crowd, who are also, many of them deeply ideological and religious, have turned on Israel. Even in the best case scenario, the Strait of Hormuz will not go back to what they were until probably the end of 2026. Right? So it will fundamentally also change the perception of security in the Gulf.
هل أوروبا تقدر نفس السؤال اللي وجهته بشأن الخليج، هل أوروبا تقدر تدافع عن نفسها بدون الولايات المتحدة؟
I think the one element that has really come to the surface as the most powerful element now in the axis are the Houthi movement, the Houthis in Yemen, and to an extent the Hashd al-Shabi that we have in Iraq. They're still standing. But we also see that there are now, because it's always been a horizontal network, right? It's never been hierarchical.
Yeah.
It was a partnership where the Houthis are not an Iranian proxy. They are primarily a Yemeni fighting force with links to Iran.
في الشرق الأوسط، المكان اللي دايما إما بيعاني من صراعات أو حتى بيستضيفها على أرضه، مفردة الحرب أصبحت علم على هذه البقعة من العالم. الحروب عندنا مش بس اللي بنشوفها على الأرض، لكن كمان اللي بتحصل من خلال وكلاء. كل طرف بيقولك إن هو بيدافع عن أمنه، بس الحقيقة إن تعريف الأمن مش بيتقال في البيانات الرسمية، بيتقال في حاجات تانية خالص. بيتقال في مين بيمول مين بيحارب نيابة عن مين، ومين مستعد يدفع الثمن، وكمان مين بيخلي غيره يدفعه. الحلقة دي عن ازاي نفهم الدافع، وبالذات الدافع الأمني. معايا النهاردة الدكتور أندرياس كريج، محاضر في الأمن الدولي في كينجز كوليدج لندن، ومتخصص في الحروب بالوكالة والصراعات الحديثة، ومؤلف كتابي ساروجيت وورفير أو الحرب بالوكالة، وسبفيرجن التفويض، استراتيجيات الإضعاف من الداخل. أهلا بيك يا دكتور.
Thanks for having me.
بداية أنا سعيد جدا بالمقابلة دي، وخلينا نعرف ما هو العنصر الأمني أو الأمن عموما بالنسبة للأطراف المتنازعة. وخلينا أقول لك الأطراف المتنازعة: إيران، الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، إسرائيل، وطبعا دول الخليج. عارف إن السؤال كبير.
Yes, that's a very big question to start. Now, what is security? Security, obviously, we don't want to be too academic, but security ultimately is about the referent object, right? Who are you trying to secure? Security of the state, security of the people, security of the leadership. And ultimately, security is a narrative, right? The way you frame it, the way you build security and the idea, the concept of security is very subjective. Each of the countries have their own subjective interpretation of security, as well as each of the leaders have. I think what's important in the Middle East to understand, particularly when we look at the parties involved in this current war with Iran, is that the three main parties to this conflict, Iran, Israel, and the Trump administration, are ultimately ideological players, right? They're not objective players in that way. So the regime in Iran is obviously very, very ideological, right? The way they frame security has been quite consistent for 5 decades, but it's ideological and it has been coherent. It has been somewhat linear for the last 50 years. Israel has changed. Some aspects of Israeli strategic culture have stayed the same. Also, the way they interpret security has stayed the same. But Netanyahu has created a new Israel, and that Israel is the one that's at war. And that's the one that's probably the most problematic Israel has ever been for the region. And why I'm saying the Trump administration as well, America has always been and had an element of ideology in the way they look at security. But the Trump administration in particular is extremely ideological. And it's actually been, there are two ideological elements that are clashing in Washington right now. One is the MAGA, the Make America Great Again ideology, America first. And on the other hand, we've got the new conservatives, the guys that actually pushed America already into the Iraq war in 2003. And it's these sort of neoconservatives that have had a traditional relationship with Israel as well. And obviously Bibi Netanyahu is very much a neoconservative. They look at security, and that's important. And I think these are the two factions that are coming together now in the conflict. The neoconservatives and Netanyahu are the ones who've been pushing for that war with Iran. They're also the ones who are saying, we have a problem with Islam, and we also have a problem with Islamism. We have a problem with local forces like Iran, and we want to dismantle them. And we're willing to take whatever means available to actually crush them. And that's extremely ideological. They don't have a narrative for how security looks like in the long run in the region. They don't really know where it's going to stop, because ultimately they look at the world as black and white, right? It's going to be you either win or you lose. There's nothing in
It's
between.
my way or the highway.
Yes. And the difference here is that the Middle East doesn't develop clear-cut black and white outcomes. It's usually outcomes exist in the gray zone. Security exists ultimately in that gray zone as well. But the neoconservatives are trying to get kind of black and white outcomes that you cannot achieve. And now they got into a war with Iran because they thought, okay, we're going to get rid of the regime that's going to solve everything. In the same way that Bibi Netanyahu got into the war against Hamas, saying, we're going to get rid of Hamas, everything will be finished. The worst onslaught in modern human history has happened in Gaza for the last 3 years nearly. And Hamas is still there. We've seen nearly 3 years of war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is still there. So what you ultimately see is that the neoconservatives are not very good at ending wars because they don't have an ultimate idea of how security looks like, because they want black and white outcomes. If you look at the region through the lens of a gray zone, where everything is somewhat never properly stable, but also doesn't have to be unstable, you have to be pragmatic. You have to manage conflict rather than solve outcomes. And if you look at security as stability, which is what, for example, the Gulf states are doing, right? The Gulf states are looking at security as stability. It's about, they want to do business, they want to trade, they want to develop. They have no interest in conflict because they think stability can be best developed through engagement, pragmatism, and outreach. There are obviously differences between Oman on one end of the spectrum and the UAE, I'd say, on the other end of the spectrum, and how they do things. But ultimately, all of them see security as stability. The neoconservatives obviously don't necessarily need stability in the short term. They say a little bit of chaos is good because it breaks everything. Once we break everything, we can actually redevelop it.
خلينا احنا دلوقتي خدنا تقريبا نظرة عامة على التعريف الأمني بشكل عام. خلينا نبريك داون لكل دولة. يعني نبدأ بإيران مثلا.
If we look at Iran, for example, Iran is a country that has been traumatized by the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. So the regime came about in 1979 and immediately was confronted by an invasion from Iraq. And that was a traumatic experience for the Iranians, a decade of war where their country, territory was invaded. So what they tried to design is what I call a campfire strategy, where they basically create fires outside of their territory to kind of bog their enemies down, keep them busy. And that's how the axis of resistance really has come about. It was meant to bog down the Americans, the Israelis, and other competitors down outside of the territory, making sure nobody sets foot on Iranian territory. And security was always the referent object for security for the Iranian regime was the regime. It was not about national security. It wasn't about people's security. It's the survival of the regime. And we can now make the case that obviously with the traumatic experience of the last year, I mean, we have to go back really to the June war in 2025, that this has now been exacerbated. More hardliners are in charge, and these people are more obsessed with regime security and regime survival at all costs, willing to clamp down. And we've seen that in January, slaughtering tens of thousands of people, young people who were protesting against the regime. And that's fundamentally what the regime wants to do. It's about regime survival. It's no longer about the survival of the people. It's not necessarily about national interest. It's security for the regime.
طيب هل النموذج نموذج الوكلاء والوكلاء بتحمي الحرب ان هي تيجي على ارض ايران، هل الحرب دي نسفت الفكرة دي؟
Now, I think the axis of resistance has undergone a transformation over the last, nearly 3 years since the 7th of October. We've seen Israeli action against Hamas, which has weakened Hamas. Action against Hezbollah has weakened Hezbollah. I think the one element that has really come to the surface as the most powerful element now in the axis are the Houthi movement, the Houthis in Yemen, and to an extent the Hashd al-Shabi that we have in Iraq. They're still standing. But we also see that there are now, because it's always been a horizontal network, right? It's never been hierarchical. Yeah. It was a partnership where the Houthis are not an Iranian proxy. They're primarily a Yemeni fighting force with links to Iran. The same is true for some of the Hashd al-Shabi. Some of them are more pro-Iranian than the others. But ultimately, it's a partnership, and Iran hasn't always kept up its side of the bargain with these proxies in the network, in the axis of resistance. So that has caused some disentanglement and re-entanglement, where the relationship has slightly changed, where we see some of the local forces, like the Houthis, like the Hashd al-Shabi, but also Hezbollah, taking decisions as they see fit when it serves their own interests. So they define security through their own local lens rather than through that ideological lens of resistance, right? Resistance is become, as a narrative, has been certainly weakened. The idea of resistance has been weakened. But that being said, they're still aligned with Iran. And, we've seen Hezbollah helping the Iranians out in this war since March. While the Houthis so far have set back, they are fighting and occasionally firing missiles at Israel, but ultimately they've decided for now they're not getting involved by blockading the Bab al-Mandab between Yemen and Somalia. Yeah. So, that's that. I think we're seeing a reconfiguration of the axis. But there's some people out there saying the axis is gone, it's been degraded. That's not the case. The axis is still there. And the Iranians have now realized they probably need to double down on the axis in order to create more pressure points. But ultimately, now the war has arrived on its own shore. I think the difference only is there are no boots on the ground. I think that's the only sort of relief that the Iranians or the regime still has, that the territory remains untouched, albeit very much harmed. And I think the Straits of Hormuz will now emerge as the most potent part of its asymmetric warfare approach, much more important than the axis of resistance, because they're seeing they can hold the whole global economy for ransom, and it works.
بعيدا عن إيران ناخد بقية الأطراف إسرائيل كمثال.
Now, if you look at Israel, it's obviously similar to the Iranians, which is quite interesting. If you look at the parties in the Middle East, most of the parties in the Middle East have a trauma, right? Most of the way they define security is based on trauma and victimhood. There's no greater victimhood in terms of felt, perceived victimhood in the Arab world or in the Middle East than in Israel. The Israelis have a very deep-seated sense of victimhood. If you see yourself constantly as a victim, through thousands of years of Jewish religion, but also the experience of the Holocaust, and then the experience of small Israel, that's the narrative in Israel, right? Small Israel being bombarded by the big Arab states and constantly fighting for survival. Everything is always existential. Israel has never accepted that the region has moved on. There isn't a party around. None of the states around Israel want to wipe Israel off the map, as might have been the case in 1948. But still the mindset is that we're surrounded by enemies. The mindset in Israel still is, if we want security, we need to fight, right? We can't have a deal. Diplomacy doesn't work. And I think the diplomatic lever of power has been completely diminished. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which maybe in 1979, led to the Camp David Accords with Egypt, and later in the 90s, a relationship with Oslo, with the Jordanians and then with the Palestinians, that Ministry of Foreign Affairs no longer exists. It's a country that's been on a war footing for 3 years, but it's also a country whose national security is entirely driven and dominated by the military. Every prime minister serves in the military. It's the most militarized society in the Middle East, right? And if all you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And that's basically how Israel approaches security. It's fight, fight, fight. But it's short term. Israel has never won a war strategically. Has never brought a war to an end. It keeps on fighting for the sake of fighting. And when it stops, it just creates the conditions to stop fighting for a little bit, but then create a pause that they can use to prepare for the next.
Deterrence.
It's, deterrence, but it's also knowing deterrence is also not an end state, right? Deterrence means you can't, in order to do deterrence, you have to constantly re-engage the enemy because you're not striking a deal. You're just keeping things in somewhat of a limbo because or the belief is, in a couple of years' time, we'll have to fight another war. Gaza was the same thing, right? Mowing the lawn, they called it, right? You got to cut the grass. 5 years later, when they grow back, we'll cut them again. Hezbollah's approach, the same thing. Syria will be the same thing. And that's the problem with Israel. It doesn't solve problems. Also because the fundamental root cause of Israeli insecurity is domestic. It's the Palestinian cause. If you deprive the Palestinians of their right of existence, of statehood, as they do, you take their land, you push them out, ethnic cleansing for decades, you create the root cause for insecurity, the resistance. And Hamas is just one small element of that resistance, right? But now the resistance is global. The resistance to occupation is global. And so the insecurity of Israel is really the Palestinian cause. Hezbollah fights them because of the Palestinian cause. Hamas fights them because of the Palestinian cause. The Houthis fight them because of the Palestinian cause. The international global public opinion has turned on Israel because of the Palestinian cause.
لكن خلينا أقطعك برضو دكتور أندرياس. موضوع أن الوكلاء اللي انت ذكرتهم بيحاربوا علشان القضية الفلسطينية ده برضو محل شك، لأن هو برضو ناريتيف. يعني ليس الدافع الوحيد بمحاربة حزب الله إسرائيل هو القضية الفلسطينية.
No, I mean, obviously Hezbollah now has become a political party in its own right. It's a political mobilization to stay in power in Lebanon. It has economic motivations to stay in power. It's a state within the state. The Palestinian cause serves as a narrative for mobilization, right? But you take that narrative away, you lose some of the mobilization power. If Israel was a normal country, behaving like a normal country, with normal neighborly relations with all the parties around, which respects the Palestinian people, and even would just go back to the Oslo Accords. I mean, two-state solution, very basic. We're not asking, for too much, right? I mean, in the end of the day, it's about, stick to what you agreed to in the 90s, the two-state solution. I think the public opinion would be in Israel's favor. Most Arabs would say, khalas, I mean, we had that relationship. Let's make peace with Israel. The Saudis certainly would do that. So I think, it might be sometimes a very interesting sort of narrative that they use for mobilization, but it's not. People mean it. I think people are mobilized because the Palestinian cause, particularly since Gaza, is right in everybody's, in your feed, in your social media.
طب هذه هي العقيدة الأمنية لإسرائيل. عايزين نشوف بقى البيج بوس الشرطي العالم وهو يونايتد ستيتس أو الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. كيف تعرف أمنها؟
No, the United States is an interesting one. The United States, obviously, we in the UK, we call them our cousins because ultimately they came out of the British Empire, right? They're very much aligned with us. But the interesting bit about the Americans that I always find is they're our more radical cousins, because going back to the idea of ideology, it was founded by religious, Protestants, right? Fundamentalists who left the UK because they thought the UK wasn't open enough religiously. So they wanted to go somewhere else, create their own religious sort of state. It was founded by radical ideologists. And it's by far, it's not a sectarian country, right? It's a very deeply religious country. And the biggest mobilizing forces in the country, particularly those that back Israel, which matters for everything that the US does in the Middle East, these are evangelicals. These evangelicals are fundamentalists. So there is something in the way that America looks at security in the Middle East that has always been framed in a religious narrative. It's obviously, people are calling it the Israel lobby, but it's there are a lot of Jews who live in America, but they don't all support Israel. I think that the Jewish community is still a very small element of this. The biggest element that keeps America bogged down and defines Middle East policy in Washington is the evangelical ideological community, right? They're Christians, they're not Jews. And they're the biggest part of the Israel lobby. It's these Christians, it's not American Jews. And so the way that America defines security in the Middle East is always through that lens. That has changed, though, over the last 3 years, since October 7th. Israel has undermined, and I think that's going to be the greatest threat to Israeli security moving forward, is that Israel relies heavily on American support.
That's correct.
For that, they need Washington to be on their side. Washington only stays on their side if the evangelicals stay on their side, if the conservatives stay on their side. But what Israel has created, what Netanyahu, I should also say, has created, is a complex now where for most people in America, they cannot just support Israel unequivocally because of what they're doing in Gaza. The images are there. You cannot deny it anymore, right? You've got ethnic cleansing, a genocidal war. And this has become a generally accepted opinion. And you have the opinion polls as well to back it up. If you look at the statistics, most Democrats anyway have turned against Israel and more pro-Palestine now. But even young Republicans, even young evangelicals, especially people from America First, right? The mega crowd, who are also, many of them deeply ideological and religious, have turned on Israel because of what Israel does to Christian Palestinians. So Israel is losing that bit. And I think there is now a shift going on within the debate on the Middle East and how America frames security in the Middle East between two camps, essentially. One is the neoconservative pro-Israel camp, and the other one is the Gulf lobby, who's become extremely powerful as well in lobbying for Middle East policy, which aligns more with the MAGA camp, the Make America Great Again camp. These two are clashing. And Israel seems to have won this round on the Iran war to its own detriment, because it was the one opportunity, the one shot Netanyahu had to show America that he means business, that he can change the regime in Iran. It has backfired, obviously, massively. I think it's the greatest strategic disaster in American history, certainly since Vietnam. And it's also a strategic disaster for Israel because they have achieved the opposite. So if you sit now in America and you go to your petrol station and you fill up your truck and you pay 3 times what you used to pay 6 weeks ago, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame Israel. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And so this war against Iran has weakened Israel, not just militarily, domestically in Israel, in the region, but particularly with American voters. And that, I think, is something that Israel will not bounce back from. It has destroyed something. And it will have an impact on the way that the Middle East policy is going to be framed moving forward. Trump is going to go at some point. Whoever's going to follow on from him will have to deal with MAGA, America First, and those people who align more with a Gulf view, a more pragmatic view of the Middle East, which is more about the economy. It's about, what we're going to get out of it. How much are we spending? What we're getting in return? And the problem with Israel as well, and that's what a lot of people don't see, Israel is a net consumer of US power. It doesn't contribute anything to US power. It takes billions of taxpayer monies from America, but doesn't deliver anything. It actually drags America into more conflict. More like, some people call it a parasite. You look at the Gulf states, they're net contributors to American power. They don't consume it. They pay for they invest trillions of dollars into the US economy. They pay for the US bases that they have in the region. They pay for salaries. They pay and maintain a lot of the arms industry in the United States, all with Gulf dollars. And so if you are sitting in America, you're looking at this like, who would we want to follow naturally in order to build our policy in the Middle East? You go with the Gulfies. You don't go with Israel.
Or the one who takes.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of where we stand at the moment. And so Gulf, the way that Middle East policy and Middle East security are being defined in Washington is in a major process of upheaval and change.
عندي سؤال والصراحة طرحته على ضيوف كتيرة قبلك، لكن ما أخدتش الإجابة الشافية، ألا وهي السؤال من شقين. الشق الأولاني، إيران أكتر من 40 سنة متحملة العقوبات الأمريكية اقتصاديا. حرب 8 سنين ضد العراق في الثمانينات، وكانت حرب استنزاف، بنت قوة دفاعية. إيه اللي خلى أو أقنع ترامب إن المرة دي مختلفة ويقدر فعلا يحارب إيران ويكسب الحرب دي؟
No, Netanyahu is on the record for at least 30 years, if not longer, of kind of lobbying one US president after another, of saying we need to go to war. It's easily winnable. Every single president has denied it, Republican and Democrat. But with Trump, he found an idiot, I have to say, unfortunately, a useful idiot, as we say, who was saying, I swallow the pill. The problem, what we have in America right now, there's so many problems if we want to deconstruct it, but America is run currently by a narcissist, right? Someone who has no critical thinking, who's never been told that he's wrong, who cannot accept that he's wrong. Worse than that, he's surrounded by sycophants, people who clap for everything he says. It looks a little bit, if you look at a cabinet meeting right now in America, looks like we're in North Korea. The supreme leader says something, everyone is clapping, wow, what a great guy. And he himself anyway thinks he's a great guy. So you have this kind of, if you look at Middle Eastern dictatorships, the worst types that we had before the Arab Spring, we wouldn't have that sort of discussion, right? Nothing would be as obvious as that. And so the decision-making is completely detached from those people who are in the know, those people who are in the planning process, those people who are actually would give critical opinion and critical assessment and do the red teaming of these decisions of saying, listen, Mr. President, we don't have a good course of action here. Because that's what anybody should have told the president. There was no good course of action militarily to pressure the Iranians to the negotiation table and make them swallow a deal that they don't want to sign. There was no good deal. But what really, and if you look at the Omani process, right? Oman was obviously in the driver's seat, Qatar supported in the back. We were getting somewhere in February, right? You can day by day, you can see the kind of meetings that were had, the concessions that were made by the Iranians, the concessions that were made by the Americans. We were getting somewhere. And here is Mr. Netanyahu. And I think if we talk about Israeli security now, since the 7th of October, it's Netanyahu's security. It's regime survival. It's a lot like the Iranians, like Iran. It's regime survival. Now, Netanyahu's regime survival war is one that doesn't care about American interests or Israeli interests, but his own personal interests. He flew, how many times has he gone to Washington? Dozens of times. Whenever he doesn't get his way, he flies there. And the problem with the narcissist of Donald Trump is he takes the opinion of the last person he speaks to. If you are the last person to speak to him, he'll take your opinion because he has no knowledge, right? He's not ideological like all the other people around him. And one thing that Mossad and the Israelis were tabling and showing in the last couple of days before the strikes were ordered on the 28th of February was intelligence of saying, look, we have penetrated the entire regime. That's what the Israelis were saying. We've penetrated every aspect of the regime. we've been able to mobilize networks domestically within Iran. They were showing the evidence from January, and the Israelis had a very good network. They were supplying arms, they were supplying money, they were providing satellite dishes and whatnot. So they've really penetrated that mobilization, and they were able to bring people onto the streets, amplifying what was an organic movement, right? I'm not saying this was an Israeli movement. It was an organic movement that they amplified. They said, we can bring you this. You give us the air power, United States, but we will bring you the networks on the ground, the boots on the ground. We have the relationship with the Kurds, and we also, we have the intelligence of where all these leaders are in Iran. We can take them out, and that will bring about the collapse. Donald Trump thought that is, and it was literally himself saying, that sounds like a good deal. The problem with the Israelis, and that's where the Israeli misperception is, this was not Netanyahu trying to fool the president. Netanyahu firmly believed that regime change was possible because he's an ideologue as well, right? He's a neoconservative. The ultimate goal was regime change. He was thinking because what they were able to do in January, they could do that again. The problem is what happened in January is the Iranian regime doubled down, killed tens of thousands of people, and thereby suppressed that mobilization. And after they did that, the deterrence that was created meant that nobody's going to move again next time around. And in many ways, the Israelis already fired all their ammunition in January. They've mobilized everything without having the air power, without having US support, without having Israeli support, and it all evaporated. Had this come together, I think if you had the mobilization we've seen in January, combined with the US and Israeli air power and taking out different leaders, I think it would have been a different war. It would have looked very differently. So I think it was an Israeli miscalculation that the fool in Washington, Donald Trump, just swallowed because he didn't know any better.
طيب خلينا بقى ننتقل للطرف الآخر اللي هو للأسف هو في الصراع بس بطريقة غير مباشرة، ألا وهو الخليج. ما هو تعريف الأمن لدول الخليج؟
Lots of external analysts. You lived in the Gulf. I lived in the Gulf. If you come to the Gulf for the first time, even if you come from the Arab world, you think about the Khalij, you think as them as one unit, right?
That's correct.
Traditionally, generally,
Pretty
most
close,
of them are Arabs.
Yeah. Muslims.
Most of them are Sunni Muslims, some Shias and some other minorities. They speak the same Khaliji dialect, right? They have the same tribal family roots, right? They come all from the same area, from Najd, central Saudi, or coming from Yemen originally. They're kind of the same. If you sit in Egypt, you will look at them and saying they're one unit. Yeah. And for a long time, they were one unit, right? And there's some Orientalists who would say, they're just some tribes with flags. But obviously, that's no longer true. These tribes have developed over the last 50 years into their own national identities. And more than that, you see how the personality of different leaders has rubbed off on the national security strategies of each of these countries. And there are increasing fundamental differences. Oman is slightly different because Oman has been a civilizational state for quite some time, right? Hundreds of years. They've had a relationship with Iran for hundreds of years. They had a relationship with Hormuz before it became part of Iran for hundreds of years. They had an empire that stretched all the way to the south of Africa. So they have a legacy that the other Gulf states don't really have. Even if you go to Saudi, the Saudi kingdom, the first one in the 18th century, it's hundreds of years after the Omanis existed already as one entity. But what we've seen over the last 50 years is a massive diversification pushed by top-down nationalism, where leaders have said, we want to create national identities. And that was an Emirati project of saying, we want you to become Emirati. It was a federation of 7 statelets, but ultimately it's become a federation that is dominated in every aspect, ideologically as well, by Abu Dhabi. So it was really top-down nationalism that we've seen over the last 20 years. The Qataris have done something similar. You've got your National Day parades, you've got your flag days and all this sort of stuff. It's all galvanizing communities. We had the blockade, obviously, of Qatar 2017 to 2021, which also led to further nationalism, where the Saudis were saying, we're Saudi. And certainly in Qatar, they also say, we're finally realizing we're the Qataris. We are being targeted for being Qataris because we are Qatar. That has led to more binding the communities together. But there's also a lot of difference in strategic culture in all of these countries. So you have a difference in the Gulf between the Bedouin traditions and Hadari sort of civilizational sort of traditions. And depending on where the royal family comes from, and I've said this previously, I mean, there's a difference between the Bedouin mentality that you have with the Bani Yas, for example, in Abu Dhabi, right? this particular tribal mentality, people who've never really had a long-term trading relationship, a mercantile relationship with the outside world. They're very much inward focused, inside. They're living inland. And you have those tribes who lived on the shores, like in Dubai, like in the Qasimi, for example, or the Al Thani, and even the Al Saud, who came from the inland, had a long-standing Hadari tradition of reaching out and maintaining relationships with the outside world. Depending on where you stand, you also have differences ideologically between Wahhabism, people call it the Wahhabism of the sea and the Wahhabism of the desert. Those people who are Bedouin tribes and those who were trading tribes. Those who were living on the seashore tended to be more flexible, more pragmatic. And that sort of pragmatism is what we tend to connect to the Gulf when we think about the Gulf. The way they look at security, Oman certainly, right? No enemies, no permanent friends. Everything is about neutrality. We're engaging with everyone. Qatar has kind of tried similar stuff, but they are more strategically and more principled in many ways. I think the Qataris have drawn red lines. They have friends and they do have some enemies. They're pragmatic, but for example, when it comes to Israel, they're quite clear where they stand. But even with Iran, I remember Hamad bin Jassim once said, about the Iranians, we lie to them, they lie to us. It's that sort of relationship where we don't really trust them. But you have the Omanis and the Qataris on one end of the spectrum, very pragmatic. And then you have the Saudis being tend to be more belligerent, also because more ideological. Pre-Mohammed bin Salman, it was a country that was run by Wahhabist ulama who wanted to bring that message of Islam to the world. So there was an element of, we need to reach out. We're exceptional, and we want to bring something to the world, which is similar to the Americans. They also have that American exceptionalism of saying we need to bring something to the world, values. And then you have the Emiratis, who since the death of Zayed, with the rise of Mohammed bin Zayed, has become Mohammed bin Zayed's country and state. And a lot of things are done very, very successfully because it's extremely hierarchical, right? When most of the Gulf societies are structured, obviously there's the core, which is the leader, but then you have different tribes who kind of horizontally organized. And then you've got Abu Dhabi, which is extremely hierarchical. Again, going back to the Bedouin mentality, the patron being MBZ. And he developed the country in his own liking, for better or for worse. But he's a military man. His Bedouin mentality is one that is unforgiving, right? It's about doubling down. It's trying to achieve what you want to achieve at all costs, and using any means necessary to do so. And this has become increasingly a diverging part and point with other Gulf leaders, where the Emiratis increasingly are seen as the odd one out, not just in the Arab world, but also in the Gulf, because of that mentality of saying it's all about security. We always have to fight. They're the ones who, obviously in Yemen, were really showing as the first time that a Gulf military was actually conducting joint military operations in a very effective way. They're the ones who've built these, what I call the axis of secessionists, right? Non-state actors, very similar to the axis of resistance, or non-state actors in Libya, in Sudan, proxies in Yemen as well, being very belligerent. And for them, security is far more ideological than for the other Gulf states. In the way that they're saying, they have a problem with Islam because they fear Islam, right? They fear Islam as a tool that could be used, not just where they're saying every Islam is political, right? And obviously, Islam is ultimately political. You don't have to make it Islamism. Islam is there are certain elements within Islam which are telling you how you're supposed to lead your life and conduct yourself vis-a-vis your leaders and how the leaders are supposed to conduct themselves. And that's a threat for Abu Dhabi, because security in Abu Dhabi is defined in reference to the regime. It's regime security. It's not security of the people. And regime survival, again, very similar to Iran and Israel. And so in terms of that, they see Islam as a threat to regime survival. And they've gone out into the world since the Arab Spring fighting a war against Islam. They call it the Ikhwan, and they say, we have a problem with the Ikhwan, with the Muslim Brotherhood. But if you then go and peel away at this is not just about the Muslim Brotherhood. It's about any form of Islam that could be used, any sort of ideology that could be used to mobilize civil society. And they've invested billions over the years since 2013-14 in kind of rolling back what they call the Ikhwan. But Ikhwan are, I had people called Ikhwan who are white. It's like when Israel says we're fighting a war against Hamas, right? This Hamas, this guy's Hamas, the journalist is Hamas, BBC is Hamas. And we have now the same idiots in the UAE saying this academic is Muslim Brotherhood, although he's not, he's not Muslim and he drinks and he's not, not leaving. I've got friends of mine who've been on a list by the Emirates who are gay, white, never had anything to do with Islam. Also Ikhwan. Everyone is Ikhwan. So it sounds funny, but it has become a seated fear within the UAE, and they've gone out to Libya, to Sudan, to Somalia, even to Yemen, saying what we're doing is we're fighting terrorism, we're fighting the Ikhwan, which is obviously nonsense. But it shows you that the way that they define regime security is against anything or anyone who dares to criticize the leadership. And it's become, in that sense, quite ideological in itself. They're saying we're the most anti-ideological country. That's what the US is saying, right? We're separating state and religion. But actually, if you peel away at this, the way that they're exporting this to Libya in the first place, and then also to Egypt, obviously it started all in Egypt in 2013, it's quite ideological in itself. It's ideological in a way that they're saying we need that, everything has to come second to the ultimate ideological goal of making sure we get rid of the ideologues. That in itself becomes an ideology in the UAE. The Ikhwan, the obsession with the Ikhwan, is nothing to do with factual, balanced, measured accounts of policy. It's become an ideology in itself, an obsession, which is, I think it's quite laughable in the same way that Israel's obsession with Hamas is laughable.
دولة الإمارات هي الوحيدة اللي بتشق الصف الخليجي خاصة أثناء الحرب دي أو بعد الحرب.
Now, there is something, I mentioned already, the Americans have that idea of American exceptionalism, right? We're the city of the hill, the shining beacon of light for freedom. The Emiratis have a similar narrative. They call it Emirati exceptionalism. The idea that the Emirates are different from everyone else. We're a different Middle Eastern country. We're different in the way that we divide religion and state, right? Islam and state are separate. Almost a Jeffersonian ideal that the Americans have as well. It's that they're saying we're not just another Middle Eastern country in the way that we approach Israel, for example. We have a relationship with Israel. It's business first. We're a country where everything is controlled. We control everything. This idea of Emirati exceptionalism is something which makes the Emiratis the odd one out. That's part of the design. They don't want to be seen as being the same as Saudi or being the same as Qatar or the same with other Arabs. Because for them, and again, I say it's not the UAE, it's Abu Dhabi, really. It's an idea of saying we want to be seen in Washington, but also in European capitals as other, as like-minded people. Because obviously there's a lot of racism in the Western world towards Arabs, towards Muslim in general. And they don't want to be part of that sort of community. They wanted to show, they have always, under MBZ, have tried to show that they're separate from that they are more, the way they dress, the way they speak, the way they refer to Islam, that this is something that is different from the Arab world. They're saying this is what held the Arab world back. This is what held the Gulf back. And so they're saying we are different in that way. This idea of separation, this ideological element of separating state and religion, is something they've tried to export to MBS in the early years. If you remember when MBS came to power, that's when that alliance, for a very short period of time, really came together, where they're saying here that we found an ally in Riyadh who's willing to clamp down on Islam and political Islam and whatever. And MBS was willing to do it because it helped his regime as well. But what we see happening now is that the ascent of the UAE from a small state to a middle power, and I think by all metrics they are a middle power, they are not just punching above their weight, they have quite significant global influence. It kind of comes a little bit at the ascent of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia realized if they want to grow, they will have to compete. They indefinitely, inevitably have to compete with the UAE, and that kind of gets them both into that sort of point of friction that they're in at the moment, where they're saying, the Saudis are saying we need to attract foreign capital, but most of foreign capital is already going to Dubai. We need to attract logistical networks, but most of the logistics pre this war were going into the UAE. This war has changed a lot of that because Saudi Arabia has shown, number one, just in terms of strategic depth, how big the country is, that they are kind of the logistical backbone, as it were, of the GCC, because they were able to trade energy via their pipelines to the Red Sea. They were able to have imports into Qatar and Kuwait, for example, come through ports in Saudi Arabia. So that logistically, they've been able to catch up while the UAE has been under constant fire. And I think the Iranians have made a clear position here, so taking a clear position of trying to destroy what the UAE has built.
Why?
Because the UAE is because of the model that the UAE is presenting. The UAE model is a Machiavellian one, and MBZ is someone who likes Machiavelli, right? Which says, again, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. We only know interest. It's all about maslaha in the end of the day. But hardcore, that in a way that whatever leads to regime strengthening and regime survival will be favored. If you have to sell your neighbor, your cousin, in order to get there, you're able to do it because it's about interests, which is fundamentally goes against the culture of Khaliji, Arab, Muslim culture, Oriental culture, if you will. The idea that and they don't know neighbors from friends, right? If they think their interest is best served by taking a position with Israel against Palestinians, they will side with Israel, and that's they call it pragmatic. I wouldn't call it pragmatism because it's purely about interest. Because in terms of values,
pragmatism, it's all about interest.
Yani, we could talk. What's the difference between values and interests? I ultimately think interests are always coated with values in the end of the day, right? They're two parts of the same coin, but it's all down to interest and the way that they do it, and that makes them somewhat predictable, but also very unpredictable. For the Saudis and the Qataris right now in this war with Iran, they want to build, and the Omanis as well, they want to build a common Gulf position. They're saying, look, America is no longer providing what they once provided. They can't, and they don't want to. We still need to buy, we're still too overly dependent on them. We still need to buy their weaponry. But ultimately, we need to find a plan B to substitute what we have with the Americans. And one way to substitute against the Iranians, but also against the Israelis, is a common Gulf position, a common Gulf security framework, a defense framework, maybe a NATO of the Gulf. This has been thrown out for a long time. The Emiratis do not want to assent to that. They don't want to be part of it. And if they do commit to it, they only commit to it half-heartedly, because ultimately they say, we're going to strike our own deal here and there because we've got the special relationship with Israel, and we always have a special relationship with America. And that's ultimately, we have to go back to 2006. This relationship between the UAE and America goes back to the DP World affair in America in 2006, when DP World, biggest logistics company in the world, wanted to take over ports in America, in the United States. And the Bush administration after 9/11 was very, very careful to strike a deal with an Arab country. There was a lot of lobbying done in Washington against the UAE-based company taking over these ports, based on racism, saying, oh, they're a Middle Eastern country, they're a Muslim country, maybe not a good look to give critical national infrastructure to a Muslim country. And that started a lobbying frenzy in Washington by the UAE to say, we need to change our narrative, we need to change our position and our perception. We need to be different from all these other Arabs, and we have to be different from all these other Muslims, because we want to, if we want to do business in the West, we have to be seen as on par with them ideologically. And that's how it all started. This is how the UAE became who they are today, by trying to appease a particular community in Washington and appeal to them. The Abraham Accords also have to be seen primarily through that. The Abraham Accords came about because it was an out-of-jail card in Washington to play with the evangelicals and the conservatives, of saying every single time you see that in Washington, when there's criticism coming about the UAE's relationship with the non-state actors, with the RSF, with the LNA in Libya, with Yemen, the problems they have with money laundering for Russians, money laundering for the Iranians as well. Every time something comes up, they play that card of saying, but we have a relationship with Israel. We've got the special relationship. And it works. It's an out of jail card for the UAE.
It works. يعني هل هي فعلا هي كانت فعالة، لكن هل هتكون فعالة في المستقبل؟
I think we're at a crossroads. Nobody knows how the region is going to look after this war. This war, and even if it was to end, even if the Americans were able to get a deal in the next coming weeks, which was likely going to look a lot more like the deal that Trump departed from, the JCPOA in 2018, right, at a massive cost of life and treasure. Let's say we get to that best case scenario, and let's hope the Strait of Hormuz gets open again and trade is going back. By the time the region bounces back to the situation that we were in February before this war, it'll take month and month and month and month. Even in the best case scenario, the Straits of Hormuz will not go back to what they were until probably the end of 2026. Right. So it will fundamentally also change the perception of security in the Gulf, where now, if you'd asked me in February, prior to the war, most, except for the UAE, would have said the Saudis and the Qataris and the Omanis would have said number one security threat, Israel. And then there was a big gap. Iran was always seen as a problem, but a problem they controlled. Israel was a problem they couldn't control.
A problem, not an enemy.
Not necessarily an enemy. Obviously, 20 years ago it was. But I think the developments of the last 10 years, we've seen that even the Saudis have realized, pragmatically we can have a relationship. Trade, peace through trade. All of that has collapsed, right? And if you ask now a Saudi where the number one enemy is, they'd probably say it's going to be Iran, and then it's going to be Israel. But then also they're saying not enemy, but a problem is going to be Trump and Washington. We can't rely on them. So things have completely fundamentally changed in this security outlook. How the UAE are going to manage it, there's going to be a gap between what they say publicly and what they actually do. Publicly, again, they have a major information network that they've built since 2006. People who are going out and saying, we're going to double down on Israel, we're going to double down on America because that's the future is going to be with that. But then you look at Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed traveling to China, striking deals with China, clearly shows they're trying to diversify. They also, the inner circle in Abu Dhabi, the Bani Fatima around MBZ and his brothers, they're realizing that you cannot rely on America. And, the UAE has good relationships with other countries, including with China and Russia, who haven't delivered. But they will try to diversify as well. But they don't want to be thrown into the same mix with the Qataris and the Omanis and the Saudis, because they're saying ultimately nothing is ever going to come out of it, right? They've openly said they condemned the GCC, they condemned the Arab League of saying we're toothless, they've condemned the Pakistanis, they condemned the Egyptians for not helping them. So they are lashing out into all directions. And then you see the Emirati ambassador to Tel Aviv 2 days ago being on the Independence Day and very proudly in Israel, proudly saying, look, I'm here in Israel and with our friends in Israel. So I think they will try to do everything at the same time. I have a little bit of Israel and America, I have a little bit of China, a little bit of Russia, but ultimately they're isolated. And I hope they come to the realization that the one thing you cannot change about all of this is the geography. They're all prisoners of geography.
Yeah, they are.
In the way that Iran is not going to go anywhere. Whatever is going to happen to this regime, it's not going to go anywhere. Iran is going to be there. You'll have to have a relationship with them, whether you want it or you don't want it. Israel is also not going to go anywhere. And that problematic Israel, at least for the next 20 years, I think Israel is going to be, it will struggle internally, but it will be there. So you have to also have a relationship with them. But all the other aspects of it, US, China, Russia, they might come, they might go. But your friends and neighbors, including they're not going to go anywhere. So you have to have a Gulf integrated approach.
لكن خليني أسأل عن قطر عشان ما اتكلمناش عليها. قطر يعني هو مثال شوية مختلف. يعني قطر من 2017 من بعد الحصار وهي بدأت تبني وساطات، حتى وساطات خارج إقليمها. يعني أنا أفهم أن مصر وسيط ما بين حماس وإسرائيل لأن بتشارك نفس الإقليم. لكن لما تبقى قطر هي الوسيطة ما بين في المحادثات ما بين حماس وإسرائيل ومصر طبعا موجودة، ما بين إيران وأمريكا ومعها عمان، ما بين طالبان اللي هي في آخر الدنيا. يعني إزاي قطر بنت القوة دي، قوة الوساطة حتى خارج الإقليم؟
I would still go back to looking at strategic culture. So we're saying, yes, on the surface, all of them are similar countries, similar experiences. But strategic culture has changed. Strategic culture is a sum of a country's identity, its history, its geography, values and norms, its institutions. And all of these institutions in particular are young. The histories of these different countries in the Gulf is quite different, right? Yes, they all had a relationship with the British at some point. They all had a relationship with the Ottomans to a certain extent. The geography also looks somewhat similar. But the royal families are different in terms of how they've developed. Qatar, for example, is a peninsula, right? Geography matters here. It's a peninsula surrounded, it's only on one end connected to the
land with Saudi.
With Saudi. but it's a maritime country. Wherever you are in Qatar, you're never too far away from the sea. So very much a Hadari, sedentary culture. Even among the Bedouins, they've always had relationships with the outside world. With the Iranians, they've always been pragmatists.
Very good point.
There is a point about, there's this narrative of the Kaaba al-Madiyum in Qatar.
No.
The idea that, they've been a point of refuge for those people who were ostracized from other countries. That's a long tradition. You go back to the 18th century, you look at the pirates, some of the pirates who were fighting the British, for example, they found refuge in Zubarah in the north west of Qatar. You look at different parts of royal families and people who went into exile from royal families elsewhere. They ended up in Qatar. The country said, we do, as long as we can do whatever we want to do, as long as you allow us to do what we want in our own country, you do what you do. You do it in your own house, whatever. You want to be, you're Sunni, you're Shia, you're Christian. We don't really care. There's been always an openness to strangers in there. But it's also a teeny tiny community. It was never big, right? Qatar was always a tiny, fairly poor backwater.
Population, yeah.
But they were pragmatic in that way. And if you look at the rise of the Al Thani in the 19th century, they were also very pragmatic. They were businessmen. They always said, okay, we need to have a deal with an outsider. It has to be the British. Later it was the Ottomans. Then it was the Americans. As long as everyone allows us to be Qatari and do what we want to do the way we want to do it, and they don't interfere in our sovereignty, we're quite happy to accept them. When there was interference in the sovereignty, the Qataris did fight back against the Ottoman, the infamous Battle of Wajba in the late 19th century. There have been fights also with the British at points until they signed the deal. But ultimately, the Qataris they're very laissez-faire, and it's a cultural thing. It's difficult to define. I always think, I had a conversation with a Qatari friend about this, there is this a mentality of adi, it's fine, khalas, I mean, we'll figure it out. That is, and they don't, and there's one thing about the Qataris which I find different from, for example, other Khaliji countries, the idea of not holding a grudge, right? Of saying, because they're a young country, young community, things always changed on that peninsula, right? The winds change, the climate changed, the weather changed. You have to make amends, right, in order to survive. That mentality also meant that you don't hold a grudge, you just move on. The blockade, I mean, this was a traumatic experience for Qatar.
It was,
but they've moved on. They don't hold grudges against Saudi. The Saudi-Qatar relationship now is deeper, I'd say, than it was prior to the blockade. So they certainly don't hold grudges. Been forgotten. They moved on. That's another part of identity that makes Qatar who they are. Why mediation? Again, if you invite anyone and you don't hold any grudges against anyone, you can have a relationship with the Taliban, with whom you fundamentally disagree on, women's education and some of the radical, crazy ideas that the Taliban have. You can have a relationship with Hezbollah. They're Shia, they're aligned with Iran. You have a relationship with Iran because you're managing that north field, that gas field, and your neighbors, they're not going to go anywhere. And as I said, Hamid bin Jassim once said, they lie to us, we lie to them, but we have that relationship. They have a relationship with, obviously, with all the different Sunni parties. They had a relationship with Muslim Brotherhood people who fled, persecution in the 1960s and 70s in Egypt and went to all places in the Gulf, but were certainly also welcomed in Qatar. You have that, Hamas obviously having their office there. You have a relationship with them. So the point of the country is that as long as you don't interfere, and this was always the thing, if the Muslim Brotherhood would have come to Qatar and trying to convert people to become Muslim Brotherhood, create a political party, it would have been a different situation. But that wasn't the case. If Hezbollah had gone around collecting money for a war in Israel in there, it would have been a problem. Same with Hamas. The countries, but it's a live and let live sort of attitude. And once you're home to all these people, because you bet on dialogue. Qatar and Oman are built around dialogue, right? Their national strategy, their national strategic culture is about dialogue, no matter what, because it's the only way forward. There's another thing we should probably add. The countries never thought they were exceptional. They never thought they were exceptional to, let's say, the Emiratis. The Emiratis think they're better than everyone else. There's this element of we're different. The Saudis have that thing as well, this pride of saying, we are Al-Saudiya, we hold the holy places of Mecca and Medina. So, we're the kingdom. We're very special. The Qataris never thought of themselves as being very special. So you also don't try to impose anything on the rest of the world. Equally, you're small. And that's another important point. The Qataris have no problem accepting that they are a small state or a small power. Doesn't mean they sometimes punch above their weight, but they also realize where their place is within the bigger scheme of things. The UAE or Abu Dhabi in particular were not happy with being a small state, a small power. They said very ambitiously now, they're pushing this narrative, we are the middle power. And they're acting like a middle power. If you're a middle power, you have to be assertive, you have to be ambitious. The Qataris are not assertive, they're not ambitious, but they want their national security. And they thought one way of doing it is through entanglement with the rest of the world. And that's exactly what they've created. Has it made them more secure during that conflict? Not necessarily. I would also say, though, had Qatar not had the relationship with Iran, the back channels, had Israel not killed a lot of the back channels that the Qataris had, like Ali Larijani, for example, things would have been very different, right? Things would have been very different had Qatar not had that relationship. Because if you look at how much they were targeted in comparison to, let's say, the UAE, especially in Dubai, there's no comparison, right? So you could make the case with all the terrible attacks on Qatar, it was still far more sustainable than what the Emiratis have suffered. And that has to do with that relationship. So I think it's a strong case for it. But then if you ask Qataris now, they're all saying we need to change. Things can't change, stay the same with the Iranians. We can't just keep that relationship and pretend nothing has happened. But my guess is the Qataris will move on, as they have with other crises, and maintain that relationship, because ultimately geography is geography. You can't change it, and you need a back channel. And the Omanis can do some things, but one thing that the Omanis cannot do is they don't have a relationship back in Europe and the United States that makes the Qataris so interesting to the Iranians. Even the hardliners who disagree with Qatar's relationship with the US appreciate that Qatar has that relationship with the US, because it's an important part of back channeling.
ارجع للسؤال بقى اللي هو بالنسبه لي محير. عارف انت يعني جاوبت على جزء منه، لكن عايز اساله بشكل مباشر. هل في اي امكانيه اولا ان الخليج العربي يتحد؟ وبرضه حتى لو مش ممكن، ايه المانع؟ ايه المانع القوي خاصه في الحاضر يعني؟
No, the biggest obstacle to this, and I have to say it, is Israel. Israel has pursued a strategy of divide and rule since 1948, or even earlier than that. They understood they were a minority in their own, in the territory that they claimed. They had to fight against the superior force of Arabs, not just Palestinians. They knew if they wanted to defeat their superior enemies, they had to do it through divide and rule and subversion. Subversion means you're trying to, you keep your enemy, it's similar like Iran as well, you keep your enemies occupied with themselves, keep them busy. And this divide and rule approach has, we've seen this happening in Lebanon. We've seen it even with the Palestinian movement. Hamas only came about because the Israelis were funding the Ikhwan in Gaza at the time, because they thought it would be a good way to divide the Palestinian front and weaken the PLO, right? So what they're doing in the Gulf through the Abraham Accords is the same thing. They're trying to divide the Gulf up. I'm saying, okay, first we start with the Emiratis. Bahrain, they are not really acting as an independent force, right? They've been aligned with the Saudis, aligned with the Emiratis. So it doesn't really count that they have the relationship. I think what Israel is more obsessed with is Saudi, Qatar, and the UAE. Qatar made it very clear they won't have a relationship. And so they've been trying to say, okay, we got the Emiratis. Now we're going to create pressure on the Gulf of saying, okay, you're either with us or against us. If you're against us, we're going to target you. Obviously, they've been targeting Qatar for years, right? Disinformation campaigns, subversion campaigns. They've funded the Israel lobby and these disinformation networks they've created all over and funded all over the Western world. The number one enemy they've had is Qatar. But we've seen these same networks now being used against the Saudis as well. Once the rift started over Yemen between Saudi and the UAE in late 2025, we've seen the same networks targeting suddenly the Saudis. And it's part of that pressure of saying, okay, you don't want to have a relationship with us, we'll make your life hell. Not that it makes a major difference, but obviously you look on social media, you look at the media reports being written in Washington, some of the newspapers by Israel-aligned outlets or Israel-aligned analysts and journalists, you get the impression there's something wrong with the Saudis. And they're using that as a pressure. So in order to bring the Gulf together, I'm not fundamentally opposed to having a relationship with Israel. I think the Gulf states should think about it in long term if Israel becomes a normal country. I unfortunately don't see this happening anytime soon, right? Even if Netanyahu goes, whoever's going to come next is going to just continue on that path. Israel is on the pathway of becoming a theocracy as well, which looks a lot more like Iran in the way they make decisions than they look like pragmatic GCC countries. But that's on a different note. But the problem here is that the Israelis, the relationship with Israel is the thorn in the side of the Saudis. The problem with Somalia, or between, again, competition UAE and Saudi, is over the Israeli relationship with Somaliland. And the rumors that we now see that the base that the Emiratis are building in Somaliland, that base might be now used by the Israelis with plausible deniability. The problem in Yemen as well, in Socotra and other places, is there were Israeli units on the ground using Emirati facilities. Sudan as well. We've seen initially a relationship between the Khartoum government and Israel with the Abraham Accords. Now that relationship has changed over the last 2-3 years during the civil war, pivoting back to a relationship between the RSF and Israel. That's right. In Libya as well, we've seen the LNA reaching out to Israel. So Israel seems to be, from a Saudi perspective, like Saudi is a middle power. They want to be accepted as the leading Arab state and country. They have that ambition. And then there is a small neighbor, your small cousin, who's going around with your enemy, trying to create these kind of outlets all over you, all around. It's not just Yemen, but Yemen is obviously, Yemen for Saudi is not an external issue, it's a domestic issue. Yeah. The Yemen issue is not seen, if you look at the peninsula, the Arab peninsula, Yemen is part of it. And so whatever happens in Yemen is seen as it's almost like a Saudi province to them. And here you inviting the Israelis along, that's unacceptable. So Israel remains the main point of friction between the GCC countries. Beyond that, and I don't think, I don't see any evidence for the Emiratis pivoting away from the Abraham Accords. Quite the contrary. I think they're doubling down, as they've said. And that's going to be an obstacle. That means, however, that doesn't defy, I think what we're seeing is not a joint GCC way of dealing with the problem of Iran and Israel. These are two problems they need to deal with at the same time. We're seeing a Sunni alliance being formed, right? Pakistan is part of it, and Turkey is part of it as well, and Saudi and Qatar. That alliance in the making, for now it's a paper tiger. And, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it doesn't look like this is going to come to fruition in kind of creating a new NATO. But every little helps at this point, right? You need to pool resources, capacity, money, get access to defense equipment. If that can help and you can share this across horizontally between these countries, Turkey is a powerful country, so is Pakistan. You can build something. Is it going to be enough? I don't know. But I don't think it necessarily comes as a united GCC front. It will be, there will be different parties and different sort of allegiances and alliances appearing in the Arab world, in the Middle East.
طيب بذكر الدفاع المشترك، هل حقا الخليج، دول الخليج تستطيع أن تدافع عن نفسها لو أخرجنا الولايات المتحدة من المعادلة؟ لأن ده هو الناريتيف خاصة في العهد الترامبي، إن إحنا بنحميكم.
The narrative has been the US is defending them, right? This is how it all started. The idea that the Gulf states' security is wedded to the security of the United States. That goes back to the 1940s, the deal that the Americans had with King Faisal in Bitter Lake, the deal that it's oil for security. That no longer holds anyway because the Americans no longer get their oil from the region. But also we've seen since the Obama years, there's been this pivot to Asia, the idea that, leading from behind, let the Gulf states take more responsibility for their own security. That's not a Trump issue. That's been going on. That's grand strategy in the United States. They want to lead from behind. They want to get out. We've seen this, I think one of the most problematic cases for the Saudis and also for other Gulf countries is what happened in 2019 when the refineries in Saudi were attacked by Iran and the Americans didn't do anything to defend them. That was a realization for the Saudis. Hold on a minute, we cannot rely on the US anymore. And they started to diversify, getting missiles from China, having a missile factory, Chinese missile factory in their own country, trying to diversify, but slowly. Qatar did the same thing. Qatar has obviously had a relationship with the Turks, had a relationship with Pakistan, had a relationship with the UK. The Emiratis had a relationship with the French. So they've all already branched out and diversified, and that's been happening for 7 years or even more, probably for a decade. But none of it has really systematically decoupled them from the Americans because the bedrock, the sort of the skeleton is still mostly American. We will see an intensification of that diversification away from America because America has not provided the security.
هل بسبب الحرب دي؟
Because of this war. This war has made them realize that the bases are actually make them more of a target than actually providing security. Not only were they unable to intercept and help them intercept the missiles. Yes, the missile interceptors were American, and yes, there was American support for it. But the base, let's look at Qatar and Al Udeid. What has Al Udeid contributed in this war to the security of Qatar? The radars were destroyed. Yes, the missile defense systems, which are owned by the Qataris, by the way, and operated by Qataris, are not they're not Americans who do it. This is Qataris supporting themselves and Qataris supporting the Al Udeid security. They're doing it for the Americans, actually. You go to the UAE, there's similar problems. You go look at Saudis, similar problems. So if you put this all together, this war has made them realize that the bases actually makes them more of a target. I don't think they will close the bases, but they will also not double down. I think there's one good thing. There's a good thing that a very prominent Emirati commentator said a couple of days ago, Abdul Halik Abdullah. He was saying, ultimately, we don't need the bases. We need access to resources. We need access to capacity, capability. We need access to defense technology from the US. And that's the way they should look at it, the Gulf states, of saying, we are buying American because we like their technology. The Americans would sell. But equally, there is an alternative now. We need to substitute this. If we want security, we need to, have a relationship with other countries, but also source our defense equipment from other countries, such as the Europeans. And one story that's been underreported is the role that the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, has had in the country, in Qatar, in defending against the missiles. Because the drones and the missiles, the drones, they cost a few $1,000s to produce. Interceptor missiles, $1.5 million a piece. Now, it was not sustainable to keep on firing these expensive air defense missiles at these drones. So most of the drones in the later part of the war were shot down by air-to-air missiles from Qatari Air Force pilots and also Royal Air Force pilots. So the Royal Air Force has played a role in defending Qatar. So it made a significant contribution. Same with the French Air Force in the UAE. They've done and helped and supported the Emirates in taking out ballistic missiles and drones coming in. So the Europeans are already playing a more important role in this. One thing the Gulf has is money. One thing Europe doesn't have is money, right?
Okay.
But what we have in Europe is technology, and we have defense companies who produce very good equipment. And there is a realization now in Europe that the relationship between Europe and the GCC is a relationship on par. The relationship between America and the Gulf is a top-down relationship. It's a relationship where the Gulf states are subservient to the Americans. And the Americans are now quite openly, Trump in particular, being very transactional, saying you do my way, or you're not getting what you want. That's the way he deals with the Europeans as well.
Yeah.
So there is an opportunity now, I think, for the Gulf states to disentangle from America, and re-entangle with the Europeans, getting access to European technology, owning stakes in European technology.
ليه مش تشاينا والصين مثلا؟ الصين وروسيا.
The problem with, there's an interesting bit. So we're saying the Americans are not defending them. And the UAE in particular were leading in diversification prior to this war.
آسف المقاطعة بس خاصة إن حتى أوروبا shifting slowly towards China.
I think the problem here is we always underestimate China. The answer is, the answer seems to be China for everything. They're leading on AI. They have great tech. Problem with China is they're an authoritarian country. In terms of values, at least from a European perspective, we have no overlap. For the Gulf, is slightly different. They're less, they're more, what's the right word? They're probably more, forgiving when it comes to not being aligned or based on values, because they're also authoritarian, and the Chinese are authoritarian. So they don't need liberal democracies. For us in Europe, we still are very obsessed with liberal democracies. But beyond values, I think there is the problem of, are the Chinese reliable? Because the Chinese are doing exactly what the Americans are doing. They're a big power. They're playing a game of weaponized interdependence, I call it. Weaponized interdependence means you create an interdependent relationship where both sides seem to win, right? Win-win. But over time, you skew this relationship into a win-lose relationship where interdependence becomes codependence, and you're overly reliant. That's exactly how it happened with America. It looks like win-win situation, right? You give us money, we give you technology. It's a trade-off, we both win. Over time, the Americans, being more powerful, they will skew that interdependence and weaponize it to make themselves indispensable to their junior partners, and then squeeze their junior partners. That's exactly how the relationship between the US and NATO is developing at the moment. China's doing the same thing. China's done this with Greece. They've done it with Italy, where they own real estate, where they own critical national infrastructure like ports, for example. They put pressure. and saying, okay, if there is a vote in the European Parliament on China, we want you to side with China or abstain. And that's basically what we've seen. We've seen the Chinese weaponizing that power as well. So from a European perspective, you're trapped between two sort of evils. On the one hand, you're overly dependent on China, on America, and they squeeze you, but you don't want to then substitute that with an over-reliance on China, who will then squeeze you. Do you want to be squeezed by China, or do you want to be squeezed by America? That's kind of the choice. So the answer to this is autonomy, strategic sovereignty. And the same problem is the same problem that the Gulf countries have. The Gulf countries are squeezed by America and could be squeezed by America in a terrible bargain, if you think about it. If you look at Qatar, UAE, and Saudi, they put $3.6 trillion into the US economy. Ridiculous sums of money. What have they gotten in return? Absolutely nothing. Right? The war, the lobbying they've done had no effect. Trump has done, today he does this, tomorrow he does this. He's been listening. He's become the poodle of Netanyahu in many ways. And he hasn't held up his side of the bargain. Now, the Europeans have received a lot of funding as well, but I do think for the sort of humble funding that's been going from the Gulf states into Europe, the Europeans have somewhat delivered on it. And they are, I think, more reliable than the Americans are. Now, if you are sitting in the Gulf, you can't rely on the Americans. Can you rely on China? And here, that's the big question, because the Emiratis had a long-standing relationship with the Chinese and the Russians, more diversified. A lot of Russian operations in Africa have been supported by Emirati companies and the Emirates themselves. Wagner, in particular, did most of their trade with through the UAE. Wagner Group. You look at China as well. The UAE have had a long-standing relationship with tech companies in China, AI and data companies in China, and have tried to diversify it. Has it helped them now in this war? No. Quite the contrary. If you ask anyone in the Gulf right now, as much as they're alienated by Donald Trump, they're also alienated by Russia and China, because Russia and China continuously support the Iranian regime. Right, they're buying oil from them, but they're also providing technology, critical technology, and also providing them with intelligence. How were the Iranians able to hit, pinpoint, targeted radar stations? In
a
towers where they knew exactly where, let's say, American soldiers were staying. This intel came from Russia and China. So from a Gulf perspective, your partner in Beijing is actually siding with your enemy because it serves their interests. So again, it's not an easy way out. It's not like you substituting one for the other. I think the answer is you go, first of all, you need to be more self-reliant, right? More autonomy, more sovereignty, and diversifying. The one thing that the Gulf has is money, right? And they are indispensable in many ways. And we're seeing that in terms of logistical supply chains now. Strait of Hormuz is absolutely detrimental, fundamental to the security, stability of the global economy. What you're going to do, but how are you going to use this? How are you going to make yourself indispensable to the rest of the world? But there are limits to that in terms of how you can use that lever to advance your own interests. And that's the very difficult decisions, the very difficult thinking that needs to happen in the Gulf, based on strategic innovation and thinking outside the box. You can't continue the way you've done for the last 20 years because it hasn't worked. So what's the plan B? And that we're in that process now.
طيب، بذكر أوروبا، عشان خلينا نختم بقى بمحور أوروبا واللي بيحصل دلوقتي وتهديد ترامب المستمر إن هو ينسحب من الناتو. السؤال الأول، هل أوروبا تقدر، نفس السؤال اللي وجهته بشأن الخليج، هل أوروبا تقدر تدافع عن نفسها بدون الولايات المتحدة؟
The simple and short answer is no, Europe cannot defend itself without American support. It's quite clear at the moment. We've seen many initiatives over the last 10 years of Europe diversifying and rebuilding its own defense base. Much of the money that's been put in billions have been put in by all NATO countries in Europe to maintain the status quo and kind of, making sure that the whole defense system doesn't collapse. Very little has trickled down in new capabilities. What we do see on the strategic level, on the political level, there's more alignment now between even the UK and France and Germany, despite the fact that Britain has left the European Union. There's more European sharing of intelligence, more sharing of capabilities. There's more sharing of joint strategic approaches, political approaches as well. On the Straits of Hormuz, we're also seeing the Europeans doing more on their own. The problem is it's fundamentally an ontological one. It's a philosophical one. If for 80 years the premise has always been America is there to defend you, your entire mindset is built around America, and you're now pulling America out of it,
you're panicking.
You're panicking, but you also don't immediately reset, because what is needed is a philosophical reset of saying, are we aligned with the Americans? And then there is this problem. Path dependency is always a problem for the Europeans, and their differences. I mean, the Germans are probably the worst in that. It's like the Germans are very path dependent. Once they've done something and it works, they will stick with it until it absolutely doesn't work anymore. And they still have the hope, in Germany in particular, that things in 2.5 years will bounce back, because Trump will go and things will go back to how they were. That's not going to happen. Trump is a very radical form of an American trend, but it's part of an American trend that we've been seeing anyway. The Americans do not want to, American taxpayers do not want to double down on European security and have Europeans free ride on that. And there is a very valid argument, because Europeans have been free riding on America for a long time. Now, building back that capability that was lost over the last 20, 30 years will take time. It will take a decade at least. But we also need to re-educate in Europe, re-educate our population. We have to re-educate our own young people of saying, yes, we live in relative peace and security, but that peace and security cannot be taken for granted, and we need to do something to ready ourselves. And we can't just say, oh, the Americans will sort it. We have to sort it. But it also means we have to, in terms of strategic terms, on Gaza, for example, we just aligned with Israel and we aligned with America. There was an opportunity for Europe to take a middle way, a third way. Let's build something with our partners in the Gulf. Strategically, we haven't done that. We lost that opportunity, and now we're waking up 3 years later, nearly 3 years, saying, oh, actually what the Israelis did wasn't that great. We're now waking up that what Israel is doing in the region is a fundamental problem to our national security. It's a problem to our stability, and most importantly, it's a problem for our prosperity, because this war with Iran was entirely avoidable, and it was done and orchestrated by the Israelis, undermining the prosperity in Europe. And that's when a lot of Europeans are now waking up to this and saying, oh my God, how could this happen? And so we need to rethink what the third way in Europe looks like outside of America, while having this partnership, but we can't be dependent on it. We have to survive.
خلينا برضه أسأل سؤال يعني منطقي جدا، ألا وهو لماذا تحتاج أوروبا أمريكا؟
It's not why it needs it, for everything. So logistics, intelligence, capacity, capability, all of that is lacking in Europe. We need the Americans are the glue that holds all this other stuff together. That doesn't mean Europe cannot exist without America.
اسبانيا موجوده، وفي دول في اوروبا بتصرح بده ان احنا مش محتاجين الحمايه الامريكيه او حتى السبورت، يعني American support.
But away from Trump is not away from America. I think it's very important. I think also from the Spanish point of view, everyone in every capital, from whether you go to Paris, you go to Berlin, you go to London, you go to Rome, will tell you they have a problem with Donald Trump.
يعني مشكلة ترامب مش أمريكا.
It's primarily with Trump right now. I mean, here is a madman who is unpredictable, who is even saying we're going to war with Denmark to get Greenland. I mean, basically going to war with NATO. That is across the red line. No normal American president would do that. The alliance is still holding. But so why we need them is because for the interim period, there is a gap, a massive gap between what America is providing to Europe in terms of defense and what is needed. If that element, that gap, if that was taken out of NATO, it would make NATO not dysfunctional, but very difficult to operate. We're not resilient enough to sustain a major combat, a major war with Russia. I think we're here in the UK on an island, but even we are subjected to hybrid warfare from the Russians. We need the Americans for that. I mean, but also we have to ready our population bottom up for a hybrid war where we're all constantly being targeted by cyber, misinformation, disinformation, sabotage of critical national infrastructure by Russian proxies. We need to ready ourselves for that, unfortunately. That is not an American problem. That's just for us to get ready. We can't just say we're going to pull the plug and say goodbye America just because we don't like Donald Trump. But equally, we need to use that period, that interim period we're in right now, to build that capability, build that resilience, build that capacity to do it ourselves.
طيب في يعني تحليل كده برضو حابب أسمع رأيك فيه، ألا وهو إن الحرب الأوكرانية الروسية ما كانت اللي هي يعني دايفرجن لإضعاف أولا الناتو، ومنح الطريق للقوى الصاعدة ألا وهي، وطبعا الاستنزاف دلوقتي كمان الموجود خلال الحرب الإيرانية، استنزاف الولايات المتحدة. كل دوت بيؤهل القوى الصاعدة ألا وهي الصين أن تصعد وتهيمن.
No, I don't believe. The thing is, I don't believe in conspiracy theories because it's not like that's not how the world works. But if you just look at the facts, the biggest winner of the last 20 years of the Iran war, the Ukraine war, the Gaza war, all the disruption we've seen, all the death we've seen, the greatest winner of all of this is China, right? Russia is not winning in Ukraine, and it's not winning by not losing. It is losing. Ukraine is losing as well. Europe is losing. We're all losing in Ukraine. Iran, no side is winning. It's not like the Iranians come out and say, oh, we're victorious. I mean, they lost a lot of people. The country is in ruins. They will survive it, which is enough for them to claim victory, but they're not winning. Israel has certainly lost the war. And
إيران ليست بحاجة للفوز، يعني كون إن هي ما بتخسرش ده فوز في حد ذاته.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there's this old Kissinger saying, right? As long as they don't lose, they win.
Yeah.
Yes. But nobody's winning effectively, right? War is bad for everyone. There's only one country that has benefited from all of it. It's China. The war in Iran has bogged down the Americans in a conflict they can't just pull out of. They have, exhausted nearly 50% of their stockpiles of missiles and bombs on this war in Iran. If there was a war with Taiwan right now between China and Taiwan, the US would look very, very bad, and they will have difficulty, getting capacity and capability into the region on time. So massive gain for China. Economically, it has ruined. We all still have to see that the impact on fuel prices, the impact on inflation. That's something we'll see in a couple of weeks and months down the line. So in terms of prosperity, we're all losing. Europe is losing. America's losing. China is also having a problem, but China is more resilient. They can bounce back. They have more reserves. Ukraine is completely ruined us in Europe in terms of the money that we have to, taxpayer money we have to spend on Ukraine, equipment we have to deliver, and also the ripple effects of missed opportunities, the way that we look at inflation, how it hit us, fuel prices, cost of living. We're all in the same boat. It's not a war. It's not that we chose to have that. That war was imposed on us, but it's something that drags us down. While the Chinese, they send a few people from North Korea to fight with the Russians to keep the balance. But ultimately, they're sitting back, like with the Iran war, they're sitting back, eating popcorn, and just enjoying the scenery, because ultimately it's bogged down their main competitor, the Americans, but it's also bogging down the Chinese, the Russians. The Russians now have no bandwidth to do anything else anywhere, especially not in Africa. So in all of this, China comes out the biggest winner. How they're going to translate this into a bigger victory, I don't know yet, but they have patience. There's something about the Chinese. The Chinese are a civilizational state that thinks in centuries, not in years. We in the West, liberal democracies, we think month to month, year to year. We don't have a bigger grand strategic vision of where we want to be in 50 years' time. The Chinese do have that. And at the moment, everything works out, most of it works out in their favor.
البعض بيقول إن الحرب الإيرانية ديت هو علامة أفول الهيمنة الأمريكية. تتفق أو تختلف؟
It's not the first sign. I think the American empire that was built during the Cold War, after the Second World War, that empire has started to collapse in 2003. The war in Iraq was the turning point. It is the single most decisive event to disrupt, degrade American power, domestically and internationally. It's the one thing that has enabled Trump to even come into power. It's the financial costs, the trillions that were spent on Afghanistan and Iraq, the death of people coming back home, the lack of strategic vision, the inability to win this war in Iraq, because we withdrew from Afghanistan and Iraq, not in a stalemate. It was a defeat for America. It has left the region less stable than it was before. The American economy much weaker than it was before. Average Americans with less money in their pocket, so it is driving populism, and it's been driving fundamentalism and mobilization that has ultimately led to MAGA and Donald Trump. So a lot of the polarization politically that is making America weak domestically is a product of the war in Iraq. The military has grown in terms of size, but it hasn't taught the military how to win wars, because ultimately it's the capability on the strategic level to actually translate these operational military victories or outcomes into political sustainable outcomes. America has been unable to do it. America has been alienating its partners. It has been alienating its regional partners, but it's also been alienating the Europeans. I mean, the first cracks between the US and Europe started in 2003 when the French and the Germans said, we're not going to go to Iraq. The British were the only ones who said we will. Now with Hormuz, it's quite clear. NATO and the Europeans said, it's not our war, it's your war. And you started the mess. You're going to get out of it. You break it, you pay it. It's a continuation of that. And also it's the idea of how to use power as well. The neoconservatives that drove America to war in 2003 were sidelined to an extent for a lot of the discourse and have now reappeared. The neoconservatives said, we will go in, we'll change, we'll bring them freedom, and that will be the end. And nothing ever materialized. The outcome was far worse than it was before. And now that makes the Americans very hesitant to use military force effectively. Because here's the thing. If the Americans really, really, really wanted a war with Iran, they could mobilize 500,000 boots on the ground, go in there. I'm not saying they're going to win it very easily, but it would be a war that could be changed. The reason that Trump is trying to do this remotely with air power, drones, few special forces, but basically without putting boots on the ground, is because of what happened in Iraq. This is kind of the trauma in American history where they constantly think back, so, oh, it can't be Iraq. Every comparison in American television right now is saying, oh my God, this is another Iraq. It's not another Vietnam. They're saying it's going to be another Iraq. And so it's haunting the Americans on every level, socially, politically, economically, militarily. And that's really broke the empire. I'm not saying that America was on the up, because, economically, there's loads of structural problems. The economy is not really growing. If it wasn't for tech and AI, America would not be growing, right? The economy would be in recession. So this war has made things so much worse, because you show that ultimately, and it started with the Houthi militia, really. If you look at the Bab al-Mandab war, that very short interaction, where the Omanis kind of created an off-ramp for Trump. Trump realized that he couldn't win a war against a couple of guys. It's a militia with flip-flops. People with flip-flops in the mountains couldn't win that. I'm not comparing the Iranians to that at all. The Iranians are a very sophisticated, civilizational state. Yeah. Right? The IRGC is very sophisticated, and they do have some good technology. But it's not a near-peer military. As in the technology, most of the technology the Iranians rely on militarily come from the 1970s. This is American equipment that was sold to them before the Islamic Revolution. And yes, they destroyed a lot of the targets they wanted to destroy. But ultimately, it hasn't made America safer. It hasn't made the region safer. It has made America, everything worse, obviously. The Strait of Hormuz was open. It's now closed for a long period of time. Ultimately, America is looking weak against an enemy that we all thought was already so weak and degraded over the last 3 years that it was just, all we needed to do is just kick in the door, it will all collapse. That was the narrative. All of that hasn't materialized. So America can't even win that sort of war. This is not a near-peer war against China. It's not a war against Russia. It's not a war against an omnipotent power. It's a middle power in that region. It's a middle power globally, and it's one of the great powers of the region. But it was already so weakened, 50 years of sanctions, and you still can't win that war. So yes, it is the end. It is already, Iraq was the beginning of the end of American empire. This is the end of American empire. And funny enough, the guy who was always saying America first, make America great again, is actually making America far worse again.
دكتور أندرياس، شكرا جدا للقاء. شكرا لتحليلك الماتع، وشكرا لقبول الدعوة.
عفوا.